This story takes place in Pakistan on the 24th of November 2011. Zainab Bibi was a 40-year-old woman who lived with her husband in the Shah Faisal colony of Karachi in Pakistan. Not much information could be found online about Zainab's life, but what I could find was that at the time, she had a 17-year-old daughter called Sonia from a previous marriage before she eventually separated from her first husband at a later date and got remarried 5 years after to another man known as Ahmad Abbas, whom I couldn't find any image of him online either, although he was said to be her daughter's school teacher. Reportedly, it was also said that Zainab had married Ahmad, which went against her family will. A maternal relative would also say that after she married her second husband, she would be banished from their community, leaving her out of contact with her family. But things were about to get worse for Zainab, as some months into her marriage with Ahmad Abbas, Zainab began to sense that her daughter wasn't going to be safe around her new husband, as Ahmad would always whisper to her whenever he was drunk on how he plans to molest or sleep with his stepdaughter. Now, at the time, it wasn't sure if Zainab really took this as the talk of a drunk man, as he was known to be a chronic drunk. He was also addicted to drugs, or if Ahmad seriously considered it, but Zainab eventually began to feel that Ahmad, her husband, might eventually assault her daughter sexually if she wasn't careful enough. So over the following weeks, leading to November 2011, she began to plan what to do. On that fateful day of November 2011, neighbors living in a certain apartment began to perceive a foul stench coming from within their neighborhood. The stench was so strong that even though something was being cooked, they still felt something must be wrong. The landlord, a man by the name of Bezad, who lives on the ground floor of a two-story green townhouse, was so upset by the bad cooking smell that he went upstairs to inquire. However, the scene that met his eyes left him scarred for life. Bezad didn't waste time to call the police and raise an alarm about the really horrible smell coming from a certain home. When the officers responded to the call, they would make their way to the apartment building, and the police began to trace the very foul stench and eventually found out that it led to the home of Zainab Bibi. When the police officers eventually arrived at Zainab's home after knocking, they discovered a cluttered room, and surrounding her were various boxes that seemed to be stuffed with some materials, and there were various kitchen equipment and with pots on the stove. It was like Zainab had planned to do some cooking, or already cooked and was about to prepare some dishes to be eaten. It was moments during their search within Zainab's home would it dawn on them on what they were looking at within one of the plates in the kitchen. It was just a matter of time before the officers dragged her by the hands, handcuffed her in what was obviously an arrest, and placed her on the van for her to be taken to the station for confession. It was while at the station that the full morbid story that led to what these officers had just discovered unfolded, as Zainab began to confess. Hi family, it's Dagvik here, and I would like to say that if you are really enjoying the stories from the channel and would like to show support in any way possible, whether it be by subscribing to the channel, liking the videos and commenting your thoughts on the stories, or even saying thanks using the super thanks and stickers, it would be greatly appreciated and actually help in improving the videos. Also, turn on all post notifications so that you would be on the loop whenever a new video is released on the channel. And with that said, let's get back into the story. As Zainab Bibi began to confess to the police what actually led to the horrid stench that filled her entire home, the officers began to piece together the very gruesome scene they had just witnessed some moments ago. It would turn out that what the officers had actually witnessed at Zainab's home as they were greeted by that bad smell was that they had found Zainab Bibi surrounded by pieces of human remains in boxes. Television networks also showed gruesome footage of what would later be confirmed to be human flesh in a bowl ready for the stove, including various other body parts that had been prepared to be cooked. While being held in the police station in the southern city of Karachi in Pakistan, on questioning, Zainab would admit to the officers as the body parts belonging to her husband, Ahmad Abbas, and this would be confirmed as the husband's head and limbs would be found to be cooked in parts within a cooking pot. Disturbingly, the body parts had also been mixed with spices and other sorts of aromatic cooking ingredients. It would also turn out that on November 24th, 2011, at around 9:30 a.m., Zainab had prepared a routine breakfast for Abbas, but the only difference was that she had sedated her husband by mixing 5 sleeping pills in his cup of tea, and as the drugs took effect within half an hour, he fell asleep, and while he had been sedated, Zainab brought out a rope and proceeded to strangle him to death with a rope before later chopping his body into several pieces. It would be when she was later about to cook the diced flesh in a bowl would she be caught. However, Zainab hadn't done the killing alone, as she had enlisted the help of her 22-year-old nephew called Zahir, who willingly assisted in dismembering the body of her husband. Zainab would later be quoted in the paper as saying, "When he finally died, I felt shudders of fear for the first time. I didn't have the courage to approach his body for the next half an hour." While at the station, when being questioned as to why she committed such a gruesome crime, she would begin to tell how her husband, Ahmad Abbas, had been speaking of how he would essay her daughter whenever he was drunk. And according to her, it concerned her a lot that she decided to take matters into her hands by killing the husband before he dared to touch her daughter. And in a desperate bid to get rid of the evidence, she decided to cook a local dish known as koma, using the flesh from her husband's arms and legs. She believed that this was the only way to practically dispose of his body. But she insisted she had no plans to eat the resulting dish or to feed it to others, adding, "I had a plan to do away with the cooked self by throwing it in a gutter. I would say to people that it had spoiled." By this statement, it was evident that Zainab had planned to cook and dispose every part of the husband she had murdered, little by little, until every part of him was completely disposed. She would also claim during her confession that she had stopped her husband, Mr. Ahmad Abbas, from molesting her daughter on several occasions, admitting that while her husband had never actually laid a hand on her daughter, but he had suggested such acts whenever he was drunk. And for the reason on seasoning the cooked flesh, actually, this had been done to curb the stench, as it was apparent that the body had been left to decay. However, it was later obvious that this never panned out as planned, as the stench was too strong to contain, given that the neighbors actually perceived it. Towards the end of the questioning, Zainab also stated not regretting her actions, which suggested a lack of remorse on her part. However, not all the cut body parts would be retrieved in the kitchen, as the rest of Mr. Abbas's body was found in a 3-foot white aluminium trunk on the premises, while a cleaver, a large kitchen knife and chains were also found at the crime scene. These would all be later transferred to the police for a post-mortem examination within the city. But this story is not yet over, as everything might possibly not appear as it seems. You see, according to a neighbor who had helped alerted the police during the ongoing investigations, this neighbor would reveal a very likely motive for the murder of Mr. Ahmad Abbas, whose own side of the story was never heard. All we've heard had been from Mrs. Zainab, whose reason for killing her husband seemed too absurd, as she admitted that although her deceased husband had never molested her daughter, but he was intending to do so, she had murdered her husband because she was scared he would eventually succeed, a crime that he hasn't even committed. The neighbor would say, and I quote, "There could be two factors behind her intention to cook the husband. One is to destroy the evidence, and the other could be her immense hatred against him over his plan to marry another woman." Now, the picture might be starting to get clear. As per reports, Mr. Ahmad had planned to marry another woman without Zainab's permission. You see, according to the family law in the Islamic country, a man has to get permission from his first wife before his second marriage. However, in majority of these Pakistani families, this law is rarely observed, as the husband could actually go ahead to marry another woman even without the permission of the first wife. However, this story might have actually gone down further than the accounts given by Zainab Bibi, because according to some online reports, this second woman Ahmad had planned to marry before he was eventually murdered turned out to be the so-called stepdaughter called Sonia. It's safe to say that if this was actually true, would have likely infuriated Mrs. Zainab, whose uncontrollable outburst of emotions could have caused her to kill Mr. Abbas in a jealous or angry rage. Also, Zainab had mentioned on how she had to cook the body to cover up the stench. But something seems to be rough with that statement. This had to also mean that by the time she was found with the cooked flesh, the husband she killed in cold blood must have been dead for at least 3 days before she began the cooking process, as that's the time it takes for a body to start its decomposition process. You see, if it was to cover the foul odor, then it would be safe to assume that she had taken time to plan out both the murder and the method of disposal, as a freshly dead person has not yet begun to decay, so there is little to no decaying stench. Before the court proceedings, Zainab had claimed that she murdered her husband after she had tried to molest her daughter. She also claimed she had stopped him from doing so on several occasions in the past. However, she later would contradict herself as she made her statement that while the husband never laid a hand on her daughter, but he used to say such dirty things whenever he came home drunk. These various loopholes made her whole story somewhat suspicious to some people, making them believe she must have killed her husband out of jealousy, possibly due to him planning to take a second wife, whether with or without her permission. Could Zainab had possibly made up the hearsay accusation to possibly cover up her true intention for the murder? During their court trial over the following years, Zainab and her nephew Zahir would appeal that the court had the period spent in captivity to her sentence. Zahir Ahmad would claim no involvement in the crime and asserted that he arrived at the house after a span of 8 years. The daughter's statement, Sonia, including her medical examination, would also be taken, as it was very important from a legal point of view. The court also observed that Zahir was made an accused in the case, as Zainab had told police that he had helped her. But basically, the evidence against him was just Zainab's statement, and there was no evidence that any intoxicating material was administered by Zahir to the deceased. The bench also observed that there were not enough evidence against Zahir to prove a case of premeditated murder, but there was sufficient evidence in the shape of body parts and crime weapons recovered from the place of the offense, coupled with his presence either inside or outside the home, which indicated that he was aware of the dismemberment of the body by the woman, and it amounted to an attempt to conceal evidence. Months following the court trial, Zahir was acquitted from the offense of premeditated murder, as the court later accepted his appeal and set aside the life term awarded to him while upholding a 7-year term for destroying evidence. But this he had already completed. The court eventually ordered that he be released. As for Zainab, the court further stated that her actions cannot be justified in any case, but apparently, the court stated that the murder was caused by a consequence of the deceased who put the teenage girl not only in fear of essay, but perhaps actually repeatedly and continuously subjected her to the same. The court would eventually accept Zainab's appeal and declare the 7-year period she spent in jail while under trial as punishment for causing disappearance of evidence, which she had already completed. She was also found guilty after ruling that the accused had cut her husband Ahmad Abbas into pieces and cooked him in a pot. On December 20th, 2018, so 7 years following the horrific murder of her husband, excluding the period she already spent in prison, the subordinate court sentenced her to life imprisonment. Nevertheless, aside the 7 years she spent while being locked up in jail during her court trials, she would go on to spend just extra 4 years in prison, making it a total of 11 years in jail, as she would be freed by the jail authorities in 2022, which meant that both of them are now technically free to integrate back into the society. As for the murder victim, Mr. Ahmad Abbas, he may or may not have made any sort of sexual remark or made a dirty move towards his stepdaughter. And even if he did, some people would agree that murdering someone in such gruesome manner may not have been the best solution. The law has to find him guilty first and hand over the judgment for any crime found. And with this came a somewhat divided opinion on this story.